So in the College of Arts and Sciences, we seek to provide a timeless education that empowers our students to connect history, culture, language, science, and other fields to respond to the situations that they will face in the future. It's hard to be ready for an event like the fall of the Berlin Wall, and I will remember my first and what turned out to be my last trip to East Berlin in 1989 on the day of the last East German state elections. And there was no sign as I walked the streets in what was then East Germany, of what would be on the horizon in just a few more months. Things change so rapidly, and in creating a new and truly free world, it really does require what a liberal arts education has and the perspective that it brings, because we don't know what's ahead, and we need to be creative in our responses. And with that, I'm particularly pleased tonight to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jeffrey Engel. He is director of the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University, a senior fellow of the Norwegian Nobel Institute and John Goodwin Tower Center for Political Studies, and a graduate of Cornell University. He received his MA and PhD in American history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison before serving as a John M. Olin postdoctoral fellow in international security studies at Yale University. Engel has authored or edited 10 books on American foreign policy, including Cold War at 30,000 Feet, The Anglo-American Fight for Aviation Supremacy, Local Consequences of the Global Cold War, The Fall of the Berlin Wall, The Revolutionary Legacy of 1989, and, as appropriate for tonight, And When the World Seemed New, George H.W. Bush and the End of the Cold War. A frequent media contributor on international and political affairs, his scholarly and popular articles have appeared in such journals as Diplomatic History, Diplomacy and Statecraft, Perspectives on History, the Los Angeles Times, and the International Journal. In 2012, he received the Stuart L. Bernoth Lecture Prize from the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations. His lecture tonight is When the World Seemed New, The End of the Cold War and the Origins of Our Times. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Engel.
Hi. Good to see you all again. It's wonderful we're back here at St. Thomas. I've been telling people all day, but it also happens to be true, that I have the great honor of being able to go around the country and see different universities and see different campuses and interact with different students and faculties. This is really my favorite. Oh, now you can actually hear me say it. That's good. What I said something nice about you, if you didn't hear that. I said this is one of my favorite campuses, this is one of my favorite faculties. I have to say, among all the educators that I have met in my years, one of the most passionate and interesting and deeply devoted to her students is your own Professor Susan Wagner. So it's, I'm still not sold on this whole internet thing. But one nice thing is that if you find people on Facebook and then find things like the German-American program and the German Studies program here at St. Thomas on Facebook, you can follow what things people are doing. And it's really exciting all the way down in Texas to see all the things that you guys are doing up here in Minnesota. So it's really wonderful. So thank you again for having me back. I am obliged at this point to mention that my wife went to Minneapolis South. So let's not tell her that I'm in St. Paul tonight. So, okay. What I want to talk to you tonight is about how we got here, how we got to the world that we live in right now, and hopefully by thinking through that journey, we can better understand the world that we're in, and then of course the really important question, which is where do we go from here? Now, I don't think I'm saying something that's going to take you by surprise if I start out by saying we appear right now to be in a moment of flux. It's not entirely clear where our country is going. It's not entirely clear where the world is going. It's not entirely clear where Europe is going. Consequently, it's not entirely clear where Germany is going. And when you have the big powers of the world not entirely clear where they're going, that is a recipe for instability. Though I will tell you, nothing like the instability that we're going to talk about in just a moment. But I think this is really useful, and I want to set the parameters at first by explaining where I come from in my perspective, which is to say that in a broad sense, there are two different types of historians that you'll meet over the course of your daily life. And whenever I say that, I'm reminded of my good friend who used to work at the CIA, who used to say, whenever somebody starts out a sentence by saying, you know, there are two types of anything, that a trap door should open, and they should be forced to spend all of eternity contemplating the complexity of the human experience. But let's go with it anyway. There are two types. The first type are those who tell you that the past is a foreign land, that the past is a place that you can hopefully visit, you could maybe learn a language, but like a foreign land and like a foreign language, you perhaps will never be entirely fluent. It'll still seem a little different. You can't quite understand the taste or get the jokes in exactly the same way. So you can try to study it and get a good approximation of what it's like, but you'll never quite get there. That's not me. I'm in the second camp, which is to say that's all well and good, a nice theory, but the past is the only thing that we have to help us understand who we are and consequently where we're going. And what's more important about this, which we'll get to in a moment, is the kinds of questions that we ask and how we choose to unfold and unravel and tell our history tells us actually more about who we are than what actually happened in the past. Now, you've all heard this old phrase that those who do not study the past are destined to repeat it. Let me assure you that phrase is actually wrong, because those who study the past are also destined to repeat it. But you'll be less surprised, which is really the key. So one of the things I want to talk about then is how we got, go back one slide, to this moment. How we got to this moment where, this is a picture taken last year in Moscow, where we have someone wearing a traditional Soviet uniform, bedazzled and bedecked with medals, and people who are, let's say, not wearing a traditional Soviet uniform. And how these two have come to intersect in our world and try to tell us about where the 21st century is and where it's going. Because ultimately, when the next slide comes up eventually, there we go, you'll see that one of the questions I think that we're still grappling with today in the 21st century is really the question that animated not just the 20th, not just the Cold War, not just the First World War or the Second World War, but actually much of, frankly, modern civilization. And that is a question not only of who controls the central area of Eurasia, but what is the central area of Eurasia? And you might want to put this in a different question to say, the red part on the map there, is that Asian or European? Now, this is an age-old question. That's Russia, if you didn't know. And this is an age-old question because the question of whether Russians are Asian or European really tells us a lot about not so much how they identify themselves, but rather how people around the world break up and identify themselves. Because ultimately, what's really important to understand the 21st century, I think, is not so much the question of whether or not Russians are European or Asian. It's a question of whether or not the rest of Europe thinks Russians are European or Asian. And by the way, ipso facto, what Americans think about all of them, and the Chinese as well. The question of identity, as we're seeing in the 21st century play out, is wrapped up in age-old historic geopolitical questions. How about every time I go like this, can you just advance it? Great. So, and one way to think about this is to come back and ask, if you want to tell the story of the 21st century, where would you begin? Now, I had a high school AP European history teacher who always used to say, if you don't know where to start, any timeline, start with the fall of the Roman Empire, because then at least you got something. Of course, then he would ask us what year that was, and that's a whole different discussion. But it's actually a good place to start, because the fall of the Roman Empire, for our purposes, is really a question when we ask, what is Western civilization, and who owns Western civilization? Because it's oftentimes told as a story of declension, a story where civilization is ransacked, and of course, what comes afterwards is the Dark Ages. That tells you all you need to know about it in many ways. But yet, one could argue that the real enlightenment comes from the influx of the societies that actually went into Rome and took out of Rome and improved Rome and improved European society. Or you might want to choose the next example, which is the Mongol invasion that moment when the Asian hordes, if you will, came into Europe. And of course, this is really particularly important for Russian identity, because this is a moment in many ways where Russian identity forms in opposition to the Mongol hordes. In many ways, the Russian story can be told as one in which they are the saviors of Europe. They're on the vanguard of Europe. Well, if we're the saviors of Europe, one might argue, why aren't we accepted? Next slide, please. Thank you. And in fact, if we go back into this question and really focus in on the Russians for a second, we can really see there's all kinds of examples in history where they're trying to ask where do they fit in the global identity. And in particular, I love this picture of, I'm looking over here and you're looking over here, so maybe I'll just go like that. I'm looking at this wonderful picture of Peter the Great. Of course, one of the most important Russian leaders who helped in many ways thrust his country into being European. And of course, one of the ways that he did that was by trying to change not just the language. If you went to the Russian court all the way up until the end of the Tsars, you wouldn't speak Russian. You would, of course, speak French. That's what proper people did. But also, you wouldn't have a beard, because people in Western Europe didn't. So one way that you can both impose a sense of culture and also, by the way, raise some nice revenue is do what we see here, which is you can impose a beard tax. That people can have a beard, but you have to pay for it. Or you might want to look at the moment of 1815 and the Congress of Vienna, when all the great powers of Europe came together to try to form the system that eventually became the 19th century. Next slide. Thank you. Or you can look at this moment, which of course has particular poignancy when we're talking about the German-American community and we're talking about German history and the German Institute, because this, of course, is a moment when Russians and Americans met, if you will, in the center of Europe in triumph for World War II, though it was not, of course, a triumph for everybody in Europe. Next slide. I prefer to look at this moment, not surprising. You knew the title of the talk going in. And that is the fall of the Berlin Wall. The moment when there was genuinely something that no one expected happening. When East and West fell, and East and West fell, the borders between them, in a spirit that cannot properly be described to people who didn't witness it. It's one of those actual places where you can say, okay, maybe it's true. The past really is a foreign place. I can tell you that it was an exuberant moment. I can tell you it was an optimistic moment. I can tell you that it was a moment that people never thought they'd see in their entire lives that suddenly happened. Something they dreamed of that occurred that wasn't supposed to. But if you weren't there and don't have the impression, it's hard for me to make those words real. So let's see if we can unpack those a little bit. Next slide. Because they also have to do with this, which of course is the same spot, the Brandenburg Gate, in the aftermath of World War II. So keep those two images in mind as we go forward, because one tells us about what Europe could become in tragedy, and the other, I think, tells us what Europe could become and the 21st century could become in hope. Next slide, please. And in fact, one way to think about this entire process is, and a good way to grasp it for you as the audience, is to think about 10 faces, 10 people that I think are key to understanding how we got to where we are. Now take a look at this map, or excuse me, at this slide, and quickly tell me who's not on this page. Ronald Reagan, thank you. Next slide. Ronald Reagan, who is, of course, as you know, the patron saint of the Republican Party. In fact, I tell my students, and I'm telling you this I see students in the crowd, so I'm telling you this as a word of advice. If you're ever playing a drinking game, the single worst drinking game you could ever play is to watch a Republican presidential primary and take a drink every time someone says the word Reagan. Okay? You will not last 5 minutes, because he is the person who, in the way modern Americans of our generation, of our times, have come to understand the story of the Cold War, he is the one who most Americans believe single-handedly won the Cold War. Please do not believe this. This is both wrong and dangerous. But let's, in fact, go forward with the next slide to see how incredibly pervasive this idea is. This is a quote from a senator, interestingly enough, a Democratic senator. I'll give you a second to look at it. And then maybe you can tell me what's wrong with this quote. And I say this not to mock the senator, but to say we used to expect our politicians to have a little sense of history. Reagan was not around for any of those things, but he's given credit for all of them. Because the way that Americans have come to understand the end of the Cold War is actually as a very simple phrase, which is, we won. In fact, my own Senator Ted Cruz is very proud of saying that that's his strategy for everything. How do you want to defeat ISIS? We're going to win, they're going to lose. How do you want to defeat Obamacare? We're going to win, they're going to lose. I often like to say that's actually not a strategy, that's an aspiration, but that's a different story. But what it tells us is that Americans have told themselves that their economic strength and their moral strength and the strength of their democratic form of government, which, by the way, they have told themselves throughout this period, throughout the entire Cold War, is appealing to everyone around the world, that that is not only the ideal system for them, but the ideal system for everyone. And more importantly, if everyone were just simply wise up and recognize just how right we are, the world would be a pretty darn good place. In fact, it really makes you think about that old saying that used to go around the State Department, tongue-in-cheek, of course, the State Department, you know what they do for a living, where they would say, you know what the real problem with international relations is? It's all the foreigners. You know, if they just, why don't they understand the world? Next slide, please. But that whole story of Reagan is wrong. And I could spend hours and hours and hours telling you why it's wrong. Just trust me on this one. But I'll give you a few data points, because the story basically hinges upon the fact that Ronald Reagan came into office in the early 1980s after having spent his entire career preaching the evil of communism. Finally being in power, he was going to do something about it, and he said, we are going to do two things. We're going to condemn the communists as evil, and we're going to spend them into oblivion, because we see cracks in their system, and we can outspend them. So he ramps up nuclear spending and military spending, by the way, to the highest level it had ever been since World War II, higher than in Vietnam. Causes, actually, very interesting and dangerously enough, we're actually finding out more and more about this every day, causes a series of near nuclear misses with the Soviets, twice at least that we know of during 1983. People were about 7 seconds from pressing the button. The public never knew about this, of course. And at the same time, also causes, as Americans understand it, the Russians to realize, first, wow, we've been wrong the whole time. And second, we know this because we can't spend enough to keep up. But what's interesting about the story of Reagan, as Americans have typically understood it, is it actually tells us a lot about this man, George Kennan, who was the father of the containment doctrine, the most important diplomat, if you will, of the 1940s. He's the one in 1946 who came up with the basic thesis for how the United States and its allies were going to wage the Cold War, a term, by the way, that had not even yet really been invented. And the story of Kennan is actually really interesting, because he was basically a standard run-of-the-mill Soviet expert in a time in the American embassy when it wasn't an American State Department. It wasn't really a great career move necessarily to be a Soviet expert. But he is stationed in Moscow in 1946 as the chargé d'affaires of the embassy, and he gets a telegram. He gets a message from the State Department. By the way, it's not addressed to him. It's addressed to everyone around the world. Everybody in the State Department got the same query from Washington, which is, what are we to make of what the Soviets are doing? Remember that picture of the American and the Soviet soldier hugging? That's already well in the past. Tensions have built, we're not sure where things are going, we're not sure what the future holds, so consequently, why are the Soviets acting in this way that seems contrary to the optimistic lessons that they, and hope that they gave us during World War II? And Kennan basically says, hallelujah. Why? Because he is the kind of guy who is waiting every day he wakes up and says, today is the day that people will ask me what I think. And he had been waiting and waiting and waiting. He had a theory. And he explains that two fundamental facts should drive American foreign policy, because two fundamental facts drive Soviet foreign policy. The first is, again, remember this is 1946, the first is that the Soviets are just Russians. That everything that they want geopolitically is the same thing that people in Moscow have wanted geopolitically for the last 500 years. And the second is actually more important for our story, and that is that they are bound to fail. Not because they're Russians, but because they've adopted communism. And I know, as a good American, Kennan says, that communism can't last. It's inherently unproductive, it won't provide what the people need, it won't keep advancing with the rest of society, and so consequently, I, George Kennan, in 1945-46, predict that it's probably going to take, I don't know, about 45 years before the entire Soviet system collapses under its own weight. And he writes this up for the State Department in something that's called the long telegram, something you've probably all heard of, But do you ever ask yourself why it's called a long telegram? It's actually remarkably descriptive. It was a very long telegram. This is back in a day when, of course, you had to pay for the word when you sent things by telegram overseas, if you couldn't send it through diplomatic pouch. And so people in the State Department were trained throughout their entire lives to write in as short bursts as possible. If you can say it in 5 words instead of 10, that's great. 2 words instead of 5, even better. If you can write it on a postcard and mail it, we love you, because you'll save us money. Because here's a surprise to you. The State Department has always been underfunded in American history. So they're really interested in saving as much as they can, which is why at the State Department, you have to picture this, when they're used to getting 3 and 4 and 5 word messages from around the world, and suddenly this 3,000 word missive rolls off the teletype, the first thing that goes through their minds is, who are we going to fire? Which is exactly Kennan's point for writing it that way, because he at least knew enough about bureaucracy to know that if they're going to fire me, which they're surely going to do, they have to read it first. And of course, once you read it, you realized how brilliant it was. He bet on himself and won, because this explanation for what was going to happen behind the Soviet bloc and the Soviet Union guided American foreign policy in many ways for the next 40 years, because Kennan again said that all we have to do is contain the Soviets, because our system is better. And again, in 40 to 45 years, next slide please, in 40 to 45 years, they will collapse. This is a picture of George Kennan in early 1989, when he was brought before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to testify on this weird thing that was going on behind the Iron Curtain. The Soviets seem to be collapsing. Soviet system is changing itself radically, not because of choice, but because of necessity, because they realize they can't advance. And lo and behold, it is what? It's about 40 to 45 years after Kennan predicted it. One of those rare moments where a person walks in and before they're asked to testify, they receive a standing ovation. By the way, that colors everything else that they say. They're very enthusiastic to talk for as long as you want when someone gives you a standing ovation. Next slide, please. So keep Kennan in mind. And what's going on in 1989 that in many ways he argues is something which wasn't the story of Ronald Reagan, but was actually a story of something which he had predicted generations before. And I want you to think about these two men for a moment. Now, the one on your right is Francis Fukuyama, who came up with a very interesting thesis as a junior State Department aide in 1989. He said, looked around the world, saw what was going on, saw the Soviet system going through changes, saw what was going, some turmoil, some democratic turmoil in Eastern Europe. He too had no idea where it was going to lead. This is early 1989. He had no idea that within a year and a half, Germany would be unified, and within 2 years, the Soviet Union would be gone. But he argued that it doesn't really matter, because I'm looking big picture here. We have come, he said, to the end of history, which is a great title, because you all remember that title, but nobody remembers what he actually said. But the book that he subsequently writes out of this becomes a bestseller. Now, what's interesting about this is actually his thesis is actually really a political theorist. His thesis was drawn from his reading of Hegelian dialectics. When's the last time a book on Hegel hit the bestseller list? Because it wasn't about Hegel. It was about who people thought they were in 1989. Because Fukuyama argued that all of human history can basically be summed up as this. All of human history has been a struggle to determine how we should govern ourselves. What system works best? We tried kings. That got pushed away. We tried pharaohs. That got pushed away. We even tried, by the 20th century, basically down to 3 basic fundamental systems. You had on the one hand fascism, you had on the other hand communism, and if you had a third hand, it would be the democracies. And the story of the Second World War and the First World War, he argued, was about, essentially, if you think about it, a global struggle to determine which system was going to survive. Think about the world, Fukuyama said, this is my analogy, not his, but think about the world as a giant NCAA basketball pool. And different types of government are competing against each other to see who's going to make it to the finals. And we have come to the finals, he said. The finals are democracy and communism, and guess what? The game is over. Democracy has won. So what's really important, he says, and why he says we're at the end of history, is not because things won't happen in the future. Things are always going to happen. As long as human beings have passions and envies, there's going to be conflict. But we're never going to argue again, he said, over what form of government we should have. The world is turning democratic. Now you can imagine who in the world thought this was a great theory. The Americans. This is a bestseller in the United States. It's subsequently a bestseller in Europe because people were trying to figure out what the heck are the Americans reading. And it's basically the Americans are reading, if you will, a validation of who they are. We win, period. The second man, though, makes the story a little bit more complicated. That's Paul Kennedy, who wrote around the same time, actually 1987, a book called The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. Again, one of those very unusual academic books that makes it into the bestseller list, which usually means people have bought it because they want to say they read it. And what Kennedy argues is that all of human history can actually be understood as cycles of empire. And empires traditionally do a very important thing when they're on the ascension. They build their industry, they build their infrastructure, they invest in education, they become powerful. And then around the midway point of their lives, they say, wow, being powerful is great. I'm going to take a nap. And I'm going to take a nap, which means I can actually start living off the rents of the things that I've done. I've done all these investments, now I can start living off the fat of the land, if you will. But of course, being human beings, we get really worried when someone starts to try to think about taking up our place or taking our stuff. Psychologically, you're actually much more concerned about losing what you have than getting more. All of us. It's ingrained into our, hardwired into our system. So consequently, empires do a really interesting thing. When they reach that apex, they start really building their military. And they start really focusing on making sure that no one can challenge them and take their stuff. And that's where the fun part about Kennedy's argument comes in. He argues that where are we? Well, first of all, we're in the dangerous period, he says, for the United States and for Great Britain, but for the United States in particular, because we are at the period where we're clearly spending more on defense than we are on development. We're not spending on infrastructure, we're not spending on industry, we're not spending on education, we're spending on building weaponry. And he argues that every time in history a society starts to do this, that's the tipping point when they crumble. That's the tipping point when the next guy who's actually building stuff comes up and takes what's theirs, which is dangerous, not just for the people who are about to lose out, he's arguing the Americans, but also because every time there's an inflection point, there's always a great power war, because the country on top doesn't like to give up, and they can still build a lot of weapons. Next slide, please. So this is the quandary that's really facing American policymakers when Reagan actually comes in. Now, you all remember, perhaps, Reagan's second campaign slogan, Morning in America. Most people apparently have forgotten his first campaign slogan, which is on this button. You might have heard that before. And it really gives a sense of what is facing American policymakers as they enter this period. Next slide, please. Because it's a period where they begin to really recognize that they are living in exactly what Paul Kennedy worried and talked about, which is the massive deindustrialization, the decline of power of the United States, even as we are militarily striding the world. So on the one hand, we have Fukuyama telling us we're great and we've won. But on the other hand, we have the economists telling us it's nice that we won, but this is the peak. This is it. It's all downhill from here. And I'd like to remind you of this by looking at this movie, Wall Street, which you may all recall as back in the day when Charlie Sheen still showed up for work. And that was a movie which, if you remember anything about this movie, you remember one line. The lead is "Greed is Good" by Gordon Gekko, the chief financier. But what people typically forget is the context of why he said this. The context was Gordon Gekko trying to get people in a Midwestern, blue-collar industrial town in the Rust Belt to sell the factory and screw the workers because they can't build anything effectively anymore. Let's at least suck out what we can. Let's sell the factory. Greed is good. Don't worry about the other guy. Greed is good. And this is the context that Americans are thinking of when they go into the movie theaters. Next slide, please. It's also the context they're thinking when they go and listen on the radio. Billy Joel's Allentown, for example. It's actually not about Allentown. It's about Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, 7 miles down the road, where Bethlehem Steel was, the country's largest steel plant, which closed down during this period, sending tens of thousands out of work. Everything which you see, by the way, played out in the 2016 election, concerns by blue-collar, white, post-ethnic, pre-Reagan voters, if you will, who were concerned about where their stability and their jobs and their economy was going to come from, was already playing out in the 1980s. And was already playing out in the political scene of the 1980s. By the way, in case you're wondering why he called it Allentown instead of Bethlehem, few things rhyme with Bethlehem. Next slide, please. So keep that all in mind. Now let's get back to the Europeans. Where they're really standing in line is in the Soviet Union. Because everything that Kennan predicted was going to happen, happened. Next slide. There, Soviet GDP, Soviet standard of living, Soviet productivity, which, by the way, had never been the equal of Western Europe. Please fixate that idea in your head. Had never been the equal of Western Europe. Suddenly, in the late 1980s, drops off a map. Where the curve falls off, that's where we are. Do I have a thing around here? Well, you can see it. And this is something which the Soviets are fundamentally aware of. And this is really the flaw of the whole Reagan won the Cold War idea. Because every single Soviet policymaker of note knew by the mid-1970s that they were in trouble, that their productivity was starting to wane. And for a long time, they were able to keep their country going because they had invested heavily in oil. And of course, you know the story of the 70s. When there's oil depression, that takes out the bottom of the Soviet economy. So they recognize they need to change. Next slide, please. But there's a real fundamental problem for the Soviets, which is nobody's willing to do it. Because the people at the top were either too old, too tired, or too afraid to change. The story of the Soviets in the 1980s, from 80 to 85, is going through 3-4 different leaders, all of whom are in their 60s, 70s, or 80s, or already infirm when they take up office. They are people who knew, if you read their internal documents, which we now have, knew that they had to do something, but didn't have the energy or the idea of what to do. Because they weren't just talking about tinkering at the parts. They knew their entire system needed some revision. It wasn't working. In fact, there's a great old joke that describes this. Stalin, Khrushchev, and Brezhnev. Brezhnev, if you don't know, was the leader in the 70s and early 80s. Stalin, Khrushchev, and Brezhnev were all riding in a train car together. And the train stops. And so, being good Soviet leaders, they start discussing, what should we do about this? And Stalin says, I know, I got this. We round up all the peasants. We kill half of them. And then the other half will be really incentivized to get the train moving again. And they talk about this for a while, debate the merits of this. And Khrushchev says, I have a better idea. My idea is what we do is we get all the peasants together, yes, that's true, but we denounce the previous engineer. And then they'll be so excited, they'll get the train moving again. And they discuss this for a while, and Brezhnev says, I got it, very easy. What if we just pull down the window shades and rock back and forth and pretend we're moving? And that's basically all you need to know about the Soviet economy in the 70s. Next slide, please. But then, finally, comes a man who's willing to do something about it, which is Mikhail Gorbachev. If you were to rank the most important people of the 20th century, I don't know how exactly you would differentiate between 1, 2, and 3, but he's in the top 5. And Gorbachev comes in and says, not only are we going to change the system, not only are we going to do this thing that nobody thinks we can do, but we're going to change the way that we think. We're going to change the way that we operate. We're going to change and bring in parts of the West. We're going to become more open. We're going to bring in parts of democracy. We're going to bring in some market forces, but we're not going to give up who we are. We're going to find some way to meld East and West, if you will, to essentially keep the social welfare concern that has driven communism from the beginning, but make it more productive. And one thing that we're going to do, he argues, is we're going to reduce military spending. Why? Because we got enough. We have 20,000 nuclear weapons, he says. Now think about how freaked out everybody in this country is over the idea that North Koreans have 13 and can't fire them very far. The Soviets have 20,000. Gorbachev knows nobody's invading us. This is no longer a threat, so why are we spending so much to try to keep up when we have enough to defend ourselves? And in fact, let's take that money and plow it back into the domestic economy. Let's try to get on that ascension line, if you will, that Paul Kennedy would describe 2 years after Gorbachev takes power. And this is, of course, where the Reagan story comes in, because if you tell this from the Reagan perspective, you would say Reagan built up, the Soviets realized they couldn't keep up, so they gave up. The story which you should be telling, which I'm telling you, is the Soviets knew they couldn't keep up, and somebody finally had the guts to try something new, which happened to coincide when the Americans were doing something on their own. Next slide, please. And Gorbachev has problems, not least of which what he's going to propose to do is very difficult, but also because there's a lot of people in the Soviet Union and in the Soviet bloc who really like the system as it is. We mentioned already the gentleman on this slide, Erich Honecker, the die-hard leader of East Germany, a true die-hard communist. You know how die-hard of a communist he was? When they took the vote in order to see whether or not he should be removed from office, he voted to remove himself from office. Why? Because decisions should be unanimous. That's how committed he was to the system. By the way, I love this picture because you can really see how excited Gorbachev is to be standing next to Honecker, who essentially epitomized everything that he disdained. Honecker was old, Gorbachev was new. Honecker was weak, Gorbachev was energetic. Honecker was no change, Gorbachev was a revolution. Next slide, please. And Gorbachev, of course, meets, in many ways, a friendly competitor, if you will, in Ronald Reagan, who by this point in his presidency in the last years thought the Soviets were doing exactly what he wanted them to do. Which raises an interesting philosophical question. If your enemy starts doing what you want them to do, are you doing it right? Or are they doing it? And this is a really interesting question. This, of course, is that famous scene in Moscow where Ronald Reagan stole a Russian baby. But it's actually a more interesting moment than that. It's when Ronald Reagan was asked in 1988 in Moscow, asked, do you still think the Soviets are an evil empire? And he said, no, 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 they've changed. That was another time. Because of this guy, Gorbachev. Because he has changed everything. Now, there's one other thing I'd like to point out about this slide that I love, which is if you look to the back right of the crowd, you see a gentleman with a naval cap. That's the American officer who is charged with carrying the nuclear football, which are the nuclear codes that have to go with the president everywhere. And I just think so much of what you need to know about the Cold War is embodied in this picture, in that the American president is carrying with him the means to destroy the world, and I guarantee you there are missiles that are aimed right at Red Square. But he has to have them with him on Red Square in case you need to blow up the world, just in case. Next slide. So again, remember that context when we think about where we are. But what Reagan never quite understood, and what Americans had a hard time understanding, was that when Gorbachev said we want to have a new system, we want to meld East and West, he wasn't talking about Fukuyama. He wasn't talking about becoming an American. He really wanted to become a European, which, by the way, is what Russians have traditionally always wanted. He looked out west and saw the brand new European community coming into form at exactly the same time. The European community, of course, born out of the ashes of World War II, born from a new generation of policymakers in Germany and France in particular, who recognized, you know, we've tried to commit societal suicide twice in this century, and we almost did it. And a third time we probably won't survive, so let's try something new. Let's try melding our economies, and let's try melding our nationalism. And we don't think melding our nationalism is going to work very quickly, but we think melding our economies will. And if we can't actually get the means to fight each other independently, perhaps we won't. And maybe in time, we'll learn to live with each other. And we'll learn to think of ourselves not as French, Germans, or whatnot, but as Europeans. And Gorbachev says, us too. That's exactly the kind of system that we want. In fact, Gorbachev begins to run around and talk about a common European home, melding East and West. He says if we can build a common European home, we can all live here on this continent together, all be productive, and we can meld the best of our systems. Wouldn't that be wonderful? To which, next slide, please. Oh, by the way, I just got this. This is my brand new slide. I love this. Just watch this. I'm so proud I actually got a slide to move. That's the European community. Now, we're not going to get much past there, but just keep in mind what's happening. The European model, if you will, is growing during this period. And that's exactly what Gorbachev, he sees the future, what he wants to become a part of. Next slide, please. So this is a problem that's facing the next guy in charge, George Bush, for the United States, who has a fundamental problem when Reagan leaves. It's not just that he's following Reagan. His real problem is that common European home thing. You know what's missing from that? An American wing. If Gorbachev is really successful, and if Gorbachev can somehow meld East and West in Europe, the Americans will probably be asked to leave. Because why are we there? Well, the Europeans think we're there to keep out the Russians. But George Bush, and by the way, every single person around him, thought that they were there for a different reason, the Americans, because they read history differently. They thought that they were in Europe because the Europeans couldn't be trusted on their own. Because the way Americans read the 20th century was this. This is probably what you learned in junior high school, by the way. World War I happened, and they couldn't figure it out themselves, so we had to go over and solve things. And then we went home, because that's what we do. And then you know what happened? We had to do it again. They couldn't solve things again. So we went over a second time. It was even bigger that time. And this time we said, we're not letting you guys get us into this again. We're staying. And that the real purpose of the American presence in Europe after 1945 was to keep Europeans who had been at each other's throats for centuries from leaping at each other's throats. We essentially were the big brother who was going to hold them down. And from the American perspective, from George Bush's perspective, a man who had grown up during this entire period and seen this over his entire life, he didn't bother to ask himself if the fact that the Europeans have not gone to war since we've been over permanently in Europe is correlation or causation. He didn't care. All he knew was the Europeans have not gone to war, and we have not been in a world war, and he had fought in a world war, and we don't want to get into another world war, so the only way to make sure that there won't be another world war is to make sure no matter what happens in Europe, we stay. So this European home stuff is very scary for him, because that might lead the Europeans to think, oh, if the Russians aren't scary anymore, Americans can go home. And we know how history plays out from his perspective. Next slide, please. Shifting back then to what's going on in Eastern Europe, as you know, there's tremendous tumult because people actually started taking Gorbachev at his word. When Gorbachev talked about democracy and openness, and more importantly, for Eastern Europe, when Gorbachev began talking about national sovereignty as something the Soviets were for the first time going to respect, people in Hungary, people in Poland really started saying, let's see how far we can push this envelope. Let's start developing our own economic ties with the West as much as we can, and let's start promoting our own democratic ideals. Because every time Gorbachev stands up, he says, we believe in democracy and we believe in national sovereignty, so let's see how far we can push this. Next slide, please. And of course, there's an alternative story going on here in the world at this time, which is, you know what happens when people in Beijing also stood up and said, we want to make sure that we have more democracy and more freedoms and more reforms. They got mowed down. Now, interesting factoid, the day of Tiananmen Square, and one of the interesting things about Tiananmen Square, by the way, is that this event was so dramatic in world history that you no longer think of Tiananmen Square as a place when I say it. If I say Tiananmen Square, you think of an event. The day of Tiananmen Square was the same day that the Polish government was democratically ejected. First time that voters in Eastern Europe were allowed to go to the polls, and they kicked out the communists. They kicked out the communists so bad that Solidarity actually won 119 of 120 seats in the Senate, and the 120th guy said, I think I'll caucus with them. Next slide. Now that picture is important because that tells you the broad context of what policymakers around the world are thinking right before this happens. When crowds start to form in Germany in particular, in East Germany in particular, people get worried. Because the real threat when the crowds had formed in Poland or in Hungary in particular was maybe the Soviets will intervene. The real threat for East Germany was, when is the government going to intervene? When is the government going to crack down? The Erich Honeckers of the world, when are they going to say no more? Which is exactly what the Chinese had done. Interestingly enough, as a way to symbolize their devotion to their system and their willingness to do anything to save socialism, Honecker consistently invited Chinese representatives to high-level functions and meetings and celebrations in East Germany after Tiananmen Square. During a period where the Chinese diplomats were basically barred from any civilized country in the world, Honecker kept inviting them in. And in fact, he used to say, I've invited them here, and I wish this was not a direct quote, but it was, I've invited them here because they could teach us something about crowd control. And the message was not subtle, that this is what we're going to do if you keep marching. Which is why what happened on this November 9th, 10th, 11th, when people started marching on the wall, was so utterly mind-boggling. Not only because it was something that people couldn't fathom, they'd never predicted. You know, when they actually asked Helmut Kohl in late October of 1989, do you ever anticipate German unification? And he said, not in my lifetime. Do you ever anticipate the wall coming down? He said, maybe we'll see some revisions, but it'll still be there. I don't see the East Germans giving up. And then suddenly, as Suzanne alluded to, there is a mistake. I think you know this story already. A mistake, the wall is opened, but because the recipe had been cooked already, if you will, somebody just needed to light the match, because everybody was ready for something to happen, it took off. Now, what's interesting about this picture is we think of 1989 and we think of Berlin, we think what happened there as a story of crowds, right? The story that you like to tell yourself is crowds marched and regimes fell. And doesn't that make us good? That makes us, as good Democrats, feel that whenever there is a democratic move, that's how the government will respond. Democrat with a small d. That's not the way which I think we need to remember the story in particular. Next slide, please. Because this was a terrifying moment for policymakers. Policymakers who worried, when the crowd begins to take charge, what happens next? When mobs form, anarchy subsequently tends to reign. And when anarchy reigns, somebody traditionally says, enough. And you know what? The East German government in particular may have decided right now to let them march on the wall, but they did not give up their guns. And if they think that anarchy is going to come next, they're going to jump in. And they're going to try in some way to stop the system from going down this path. And in particular, Gorbachev has a great worry, which is if the Germans keep causing trouble in the international system by dancing around so much with enthusiasm for democracy, destroying East Germany in the process, I'm going to be killed. Because he knows that his big opposition in the world comes from Soviet communist hardliners who thinks he's done too much. And that the loss of East Germany will symbolize for them where Russia might go, where the Soviet Union might go, so they will get rid of him before it can get there. So when the Berlin Wall is happening and we start talking about these stories of people celebrating, please keep in mind that what's really going on behind the scenes is policymakers around the world are frantically calling up each other, saying, what the heck is going on? And what can we do to solve this problem? There's actually a wonderful moment where George Bush is in his office and he's watching this on TV, just like everybody else is watching on TV. This is the dawn of the CNN age. And he's just sitting there befuddled because he can't imagine this has actually happened. And his press secretary comes to him and says, Mr. President, you really need to make a statement. And Bush says, I don't know what I would say. Go away. And then Marlon Fitzwater comes back 20 minutes later and says, really, you got to make a statement. And he says, go away. This happens 4 times. Finally, he says, fine, I'll make a statement. And he brings the press in, and it's actually beautiful. You can watch it on YouTube. He speaks for a half an hour and gives a master class in how a politician can talk and say nothing. Because he's worried that whatever he says will reverberate around the world. If he celebrates too much, that might inspire the communists, who are still diehard communists, to leap up and take over and get rid of Gorbachev. So in the midst of all this chaos, and this is where the story really starts to get good, and we really start to get into the 21st century. This is really the story of the conflict of the 21st century. In the midst of all this chaos, we realize that the fundamental question that still needs to be resolved is one that's familiar to this audience, which is the question of Germany. Ultimately, is Germany going to be allowed to unify? Allowed, by the way, is the operative word, because the 4 powers still had legal authority over them stemming from World War II. The 4 powers, Britain, France, United States, and the Soviet Union. And more importantly, if they unify, where will they unify? I don't mean that geographically. They're not going to move Germany. But will Germany be part of the East or the West? Will it stay part of NATO, perhaps, or will it become part of the Warsaw Pact? It's not inconceivable. Or most likely, will it become neutral? This is really a fundamental question. By the way, 85% of Germans polled at this time said they really want to be neutral. They're not really interested in this East War, West fight that was over them from the last decades. Let's see if we can move away from it. Next slide, please. But of course, Helmut Kohl, the man who just weeks before had said, I'll never see unification in my lifetime, he was, if nothing else, a man who could seize an opportunity. And he suddenly sees, I have the opportunity to go down in history as the father of my country, if I can just find some way to push forward. And he decides to do something which I think is tactically brilliant. He declares, 2 weeks after the wall comes down, we're going for unification, without telling anybody else. Oh, I mean, he didn't tell anybody else ahead of time. He didn't tell the Soviets, didn't tell the Americans, didn't tell anybody. Now you've done it, if you will. Now you've got a problem that you've laid out there that the world has to solve. Next slide. And of course, as you know, when Europeans think of German unification in 1989, they immediately harken back to 1945 and the difficulties that Germany, in their minds, had caused. Next slide, please. And of course, this is best understood, I think, actually, because it's a little bit of a sensitive subject. The way in which people perceive German character in Europe, especially at the end of the Cold War, when many people from the Cold War, of course, or excuse me, at the end of the Second World War were still alive. And there was a great sense in European circles, and in particular in American circles, that that lesson of history that I told you about that said that Europeans always cause each other's wars, that really wasn't the story. The problem was, as most Americans understood it, that Germans caused wars. They were, as Henry Kissinger said, too big for Europe, but too small for the rest of the world. And they had to be contained, and that when they were unified, bad things happened. Now, one way to understand this, by the way, is actually looking back at the jokes from 1989, 1990. Because jokes are actually a really great way to understand what people innately believe, because if you don't innately get the joke, you don't laugh. Which means you have to know the story ahead of time to know it's funny. So let me tell you a couple jokes. Johnny Carson says, you know, I hear the Berlin Wall is down and the Germans can go anywhere they want in Europe. Wasn't that the problem back in 1939? Okay, that's the funniest one. Until Dennis Miller says, you know, the real problem with German unification is that it's sort of like a Dean Martin, Jerry Lewis reconciliation. I never really liked any of their early stuff, and I don't need to see any more. And then Dennis Miller has the best line. He says, the real problem with German unification, he says not so much German unification as a problem, he says it's going to take 3 phases. First, there'll be economic unification. Second, there'll be political unification. And third, France surrenders. Okay, that one works. Next slide. And of course, the Soviets in particular are adamant that the Germans should not be allowed to unify. Next slide, please, because they suffered as much as anyone. And the British and the French are also privately not very keen for this idea. Now, neither of them can necessarily come out openly and say it, certainly not the French, but both Francois Mitterrand and Margaret Thatcher, who had both lived through World War II, were both themselves very much concerned about what would happen if the Germans were allowed to come back together again. Next slide, please. So the only person among the big 4 who was willing to work with Gorbachev was George Bush. And not because, work with Helmut Kohl. And not because necessarily he thought Kohl was right. Yeah, he happened to think Kohl was right, but that's not what animated him. He thought the Germans were no longer a threat. He thought the Germans had lived long enough as a democracy. He thought democracy had sunk in. But Bush realized something more important, which is, I will cut a deal with you, Helmut Kohl, he says, at Camp David on February 25th of 1990, on this hike. He says, I will cut a deal with you. I will support your unification, and you will get it, because I am the most powerful man in the world. But you have to do something for me, which is united Germany has to stay in NATO. Why? Because NATO only makes sense if Germany is there. It's the #1 manpower provider and the #2 monetary provider. And without NATO, why are the Americans in Europe? And of course, as Bush believes, without the Americans in Europe, all hell will break loose. Next slide, please. And of course, they cut this deal. But this leaves this man out, which is Mikhail Gorbachev. Next slide, please. Who is also facing his own problems again, not only from the Soviet military at this time, but also from his left flank. People saying, you haven't done enough, you haven't moved far enough. And Gorbachev is deeply, profoundly worried that if I somehow, not only now that I've allowed the wall to fall, as far as the world is concerned, we all know it wasn't really my doing, but we all think it was my doing. Now that we've allowed the wall to fall, if we allow the Germans to unify in NATO, which means moving the border of NATO further towards Russia, I'm out of a job and probably out of breath. Next slide. But ultimately, Gorbachev believes that he has no choice. He believes he has no choice, so he cuts a deal with the West on one condition. Actually, there's a couple of conditions, but one condition that he gives up. The things he was supposed to get were economic aid and acceptance into Western Europe, a fast track, if you will, to join the European community. And in exchange for this, he would allow Germany to unify. Oh, wait, there's one more thing. The eastern border of NATO must never move to the east. And in fact, Secretary of State James Baker gave an explicit promise in early 1990 that he said, and these are his words, "We will not move it 1 inch to the east." And then a funny thing happened. Baker was a really good lawyer, probably the best lawyer of the 20th century politically. And he recognized that, you know what, I got Gorbachev to agree with that without him signing any documents. And as any good lawyer knows, if you don't write it down, it doesn't exist. So consequently, the situation changes. When Baker first made that pledge that we will not move 1 inch to the east, he was talking about the border between West Germany and East Germany. Subsequently, they recognized, okay, that makes no sense. You have to have Germany in one plan or another. And then, over time, you wind up with the situation where other people in Eastern Europe desperately ask to join the club. They too want to be part of NATO. They too want to be part of the West. And because it was never written down, subsequent administrations, Clinton and Bush in particular, are not bound by that oral promise. And NATO is able to expand. Which leads, by the way, directly to this scene, Boris Yeltsin standing on a tank. Why is he standing on a tank in August of 1990? Because there had finally been the coup against Gorbachev. And the number one thing that the coup plotters were concerned about was that you sold us out over NATO. And you sold us out by selling out Eastern Germany. That's the moment where we're going to launch our coup. It was a terrible coup. They did all kinds of things wrong. There was actually a playbook for how to do a coup. They broke every play. And so it doesn't last. And Yeltsin is able to stand on this tank and declare democracy. Next slide. Which, of course, leads him to be more powerful than Gorbachev. Within 2 weeks, Yeltsin is signing the final treaties that would end the Soviet Union without Mikhail Gorbachev's consent. Stop and think about that for a minute. This superpower is about to go away by treaty, and they didn't even negotiate its own demise. Next slide. And of course, Yeltsin becomes subsequently the face of Russia. And of course, Yeltsin, the big burly man, the fun guy he's good to have a drink with. He has more than one. He's the one that we're going to put our future on for America, the man who stood up and said, "We believe in democracy." Next slide. Now remember this picture of Yeltsin standing on top of the tank? Next slide. This is what happens 2 years later. When Yeltsin, as president, doesn't really think that this democracy thing, he didn't realize that that meant that people actually got a say in how he ruled. And when the the Russian Congress decides to stand up, if you will, to Yeltsin, like any good Soviet leader, he blows them up, seizes power, and takes control, and sets off, I think, a chain reaction in Soviet politics wherein people begin to recognize that power in and of itself is a valuable good thing. At the same time, next slide, that they begin to recognize, just jump ahead actually. There. At the same time, they recognize that, you know that chart I showed you before about things looking bad in Europe? Or excuse me, things looking bad for the Soviets economically? In the 1990s, it really drops off the map. During the 1990s, Soviet life expectancy declines, Soviet standard of living declines, Soviet alcoholism goes up, Soviet infant mortality rate also goes up. It's a terrible time to be in Russia. At the same time that the political scene is telling you that the person who has more and more power seems to be the one who is the only one who's able to get things done. Because you promised us, Mikhail Gorbachev and the West, that if we just transformed, we would be able to get all the prosperity of the West, and instead we got higher crime and lower standard of living and political chaos. And by the way, here's the kicker, we got kicked in the teeth. Because that NATO thing that we promised has now expanded all the way up to our borders. Now ultimately, this story comes to a head with a person who you know, or have heard of. I don't know if anybody's met him personally, I'd like to know. Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin, who of course was in East Germany when the wall fell. Vladimir Putin, who saw the crowds march. Vladimir Putin, who was a KGB director in Dresden, saw crowds marching on his headquarters, called for resupplies and called for reinforcements, and you know what? The reinforcements never showed up. And when he asked, after the crowd had finally dissipated, why didn't you show up? The answer was, well, Moscow was silent. Moscow wouldn't even come to protect its own troops. So his lesson of this, basically, is twofold. The first is, if you trust the West, you're going to be lied to. Just look what he thinks about the deal that Gorbachev cut. That tells you all you need to know about trusting the West. The second thing that he learns is power only works if it's centralized and if you're willing to use it. At the moment that Putin was under attack from crowds, calling for reinforcements, the Soviets had 300,000 armed troops in East Germany. From his perspective, that was more than enough power to rescue him. And it was not deployed. So deploying power is just as important as having power. And oh, by the way, he learned a third thing. This is probably the most important thing of all, which is we were promised that we would join with Europe, that we would be fast-tracked to the European community, but more importantly, that we would be accepted as equals finally within Western Europe, and that hasn't happened. So consequently, when an interesting thing begins to happen, look at the chart here of the GDP of Russia. Right around the year 2000, when Yeltsin takes over, it starts to go up. Now, it doesn't go up great, but it's a lot better than it was just a decade before, right? So consequently, if you are a Russian citizen and you say to yourself, you know, we got rid of that Yeltsin guy who was promising democracy, and his replacement said, we need more power, we need to stand up to the West, we need to be stronger, and we need to centralize authority, and life got better, maybe there's a lot to that argument. In fact, as you know, Putin cuts a very interesting deal with the oligarchs, with those who hold the economy. He says, I'll make you this deal. I will not mess with your running of the economy so long as you give me 10%. I mean, he's still a mob boss. He has to get his 10%. I will not mess with your running of the economy if you don't mess with politics. If you allow me to basically shed away most of these trappings of democracy to get back to real power. And of course, we all know what happens to anybody, and any oligarch in particular, who decides to meddle in politics in Russia. They quickly wind up dead. So it's a good way to centralize power. Which leads us, I think, therefore, to the real problems of the 21st century. From the American perspective, we were supposed to have all this wonderful peace and democracy, but more importantly, we were supposed to have peace. Which is to say, Fukuyama had promised us a world full of democracies. And we all know democracies don't fight with each other. Statistically, almost true. By the way, it's very interesting. Democracies actually fight more than non-democracies. They just don't fight with each other that often. So if you get a world full of democracies, you're probably going to have less fighting. Well, you know what? That didn't happen. I don't recall the last 20 years being ones of particular peace for the American people. Similarly, we were supposed to have economic boom. After we shed all the Cold War spending, we were supposed to have a boom. And we did have a bit of a boom in the 1990s. But ultimately, I think we see the problems that Kennedy laid out coming home to roost, which is you can live for a while off the enthusiasm of winning the Cold War, but eventually the deindustrialization and the lack of investment that the Cold War caused in industry and in infrastructure will come home to bear. So Americans have left the 21st century, entered the 21st century, if you will, disillusioned with everything that was supposed to happen in the end of the Cold War. You know the Russian story. They're deeply disillusioned with the end of the Cold War, and more importantly, deeply disillusioned with any notion of trying to trust the West ever again. Now, what are the other two major parties here? We've only talked about the Chinese very, very briefly, but they're still around. That same government that sent the tanks in 1989 is still in charge. And they essentially have cut their own deal with their people, which is, we will give you economic prosperity. We will give you the free market. You just don't get much freedom to go with it. Economic prosperity without political freedom. By the way, an experiment that's basically never been tried before in human history, so we'll see how that plays out. But what that really means is the Chinese, and this is a key to understanding them, have no wiggle room when it comes to making sure that their economy keeps moving forward. Because the deal will trade you economic prosperity for your freedom only works as long as the prosperity keeps coming. Which is why we see the Chinese being aggressive, for example, in the South China Sea, because that's where the oil deposits are. We need to keep this baby going, or else we'll have real problems. And what about our good friends, the Europeans and the Germans? Well, their story is, I think, the most interesting of all, and I'll end on this, because they're the ones who were supposed to have had the actual right solution, which, of course, was the European community, which was a decline of nationalism, integrated economies, integrated sense of sovereignty, if you will, which was going to lead to a period of peace and prosperity. And here's the other thing, good feelings and pushing away the problems of the 20th century. You know, those problems like ethnic hatred, religious violence, nationalism. I don't need to tell this room that those have not gone away. And in fact, what we've seen over the past 18 months in particular is incredible stresses on this system that was supposed to be a model, leading not only to the near collapse of the center post politically of that model, I mean Germany, because the German government decided to do something for humanitarian and not political reasons, that is letting in a whole bunch of people who needed help. And then, of course, they lost their second major pillar, which was Great Britain. Why? Because I would argue the British voters looked at the Germans and said, well, that's just a little bit too scary, letting in all those people. We need to be out of this system. So consequently, what we're seeing, and I hate to end on a down note, is all the problems of the world today stem back from the problems that of the way the Cold War ended and solved, with the broken promises, but also, more importantly, the ways in which people understand and interpret what happened during that period. The promises made and the promises kept, and more importantly, I think, the promises that never came to be. So thank you all very much for your time.
So while Jeffrey catches his breath and gets some of this addictive, for me at least, spritzer, we have Haley and Jack, I believe, who are going to be the microphone runners. You can figure it out. So I also would like to thank the German students, first of all, Rina von Essen, my fantastic EA, who has been instrumental in helping with this event, and Moira and Haley, who's right here, and of course I also would like to thank the musicians, which I thought were fantastic this year.
Yes, they were.
I don't know if they're still here. So if you're a German student and you have one of those assignments to do a German event and take a picture to prove that you actually went to the event, now I think would be a great time to take a selfie with Jeffrey. Get up and take this, and everyone else start thinking of questions, and then Jack is there. He will be jogging through the aisles to help you get the microphone. Do we have a first question? No, we don't have another one.
I am perfectly willing to accept that everything I said was more than enough and right. So, you know.
Awesome presentation, Jeffrey. I'm curious about Gorbachev's version of events. Has he ever spoken publicly or on record in saying, I got double-crossed?
Oh, yes, quite often, actually. He is, as you know, Gorbachev is only slightly more popular than bubonic plague in Russia. He's blamed for everything that subsequently happened, but he has been very clear the whole way through that he had a deal. And this is one of those places where we have to parse it very carefully, because I contend, and this is, you know, I had to spend sort of 2.5 chapters on my book thinking about what the word deal means, because he did have a deal at that time, and then the parameters changed. So he rightly, I think, thinks that he got screwed, but he also will concede in his quieter moments, I didn't play my hand very well to make sure I could solidify what I had actually negotiated. But there's no doubt in his mind, and frankly no doubt in anybody's mind in Russia, that a deal was cut and broken, so, which really animates a lot of Putin's nationalism.
I understood you to say that there were promises that should have been made and that were not made. So I guess the promise, maybe a solid promise to Gorbachev would be one of them. What are the others, and could they still be made?
That's a great question. So one of the other things that single most important thing in many ways that Gorbachev thought he had achieved was that he was going to receive economic aid and trade options that would help him keep the economy righted so it wouldn't bottom out the way it did. Now, here's a really interesting problem. The West actually gave a great deal of money. Not as much money as, everybody always said, we need a new Marshall Plan. There wasn't as much money dollar for dollar as the Marshall Plan, and one of the reasons was because, as Paul Kennedy predicted, the American economy went into a little bit of a recession in the early 1990s, just when these trade deals were being negotiated. So there wasn't quite as much money as perhaps policymakers would have wanted. But they also recognized a second problem, which is there is nothing to do to keep the Soviet economy from crashing. Nobody has ever transformed an economy from complete socialism into complete capitalism, ever. And by the way, we don't think this could be done painlessly. So the analogy they used to use was, well, what the Soviets have done is they've jumped out of an airplane without a parachute. And at some point, they'd like us to hand them a little tiki umbrella. It's not going to help. So everything that the Americans and the Germans in particular did, Germans much more than the Americans, to give aid was done basically with recognition it's not going to help. So the interesting question about the graph which I showed that showed the GDP for the Soviets diving in the 90s and then starting to tick up around 2000, that's about the time that anybody might have expected it to tip up, no matter how much aid you gave. But from the Russian perspective, they say we gave up so much and what we got was a decade of misery. And why didn't you give more? Even though the economists on the Western side said, there's nothing we can give. The other analogy I like to use is it's like giving somebody a blood transfusion when they're hemorrhaging out of every part of their body. At some point, you can't put enough blood back in. So the promises that were made from the Russian perspective was massive aid. You don't seem satisfied with that answer.
So where do we go from here?
You come to that moment in a lecture where you realize, do you really want to be invited back? And the reason I say that is because the answer is, whatever I say next is politically contentious. I do not think where we go from here is by ignoring that the Russians have decided that they cannot compete with the West economically and cannot even compete with the West ideologically, so instead they're competing with the West on the cheap, which is through cyber, and also through trying to undermine Western institutions. So if you cannot build up your own society, you may as well knock down your competitors down to your level, is the basic logic. This is the fundamental reason why the Russians fiddled, if you will, with the last elections, not only in the United States, but in Great Britain, but in France, and I think we'll find out soon, in Germany as well. It wasn't actually because they were hoping that Donald Trump would win. As far as they're concerned, they hit the jackpot on that one. But what they really wanted to do was to make people question Western institutions and Western values. Because if you can make people question not only what truth is, but also the very sincerity of your leaders, i.e. the one who you expect to win, Hillary Clinton, then the West will be weaker, and that will help us. So one of the things I think that we need to do as a country, first of all, is recognize this threat, and as a Western society, this threat to what is really the most important thing of our institutions, which is our common understanding of language and truth. Put in easy language, we need to make sure politicians speak the truth. It's a shocking thing, I know. But also, we need to be willing to recognize where the threat is coming from. And here I'll go completely political. There is, as near as I can tell, only one person in America who still does not believe the Russians messed in the domestic election in 2016. Only one. But as long as he refuses to acknowledge that or do anything about it or believe it, you're not going to get a lot of real vicious response to what the Russians are continuing to do. Let me just riff on this for 1 second, because one of the things that's really important about what the Obama administration did in their last year, we now know of at least 2 occasions. There were probably more, but we only know of 2. Ask me in 50 years, we'll probably know of more. But we now know of at least 2 occasions where Barack Obama directly called Vladimir Putin and said, stop what you're doing, we know what you're doing, because if you do not, we will turn the lights off in your country. Everything you think you can do in cyber, we're a lot better. So stop. And in both of those occasions, according to the reporting, what they were doing at the time, the Russians stopped. Now, they kept doing other things, of course, but whatever they were doing at that moment, they stopped. So ask yourself this question. Do you picture the current commander-in-chief picking up the phone and calling Vladimir Putin and saying, stop or else? It's less likely than with Obama or Clinton. So I think one thing that we need to do is stand up to a person who is interested in undermining institutions.
I wanted to talk about Germany and where Germany fits, wavering between West and East. And the one person who always springs to my mind and some of the things that happened is Gerhard Schroeder, and taking his job with, I think it was Gazprom. And maybe if you have some thoughts about Gerhard and what's going on with Germany there.
I don't necessarily have any thoughts on him, to be honest. But I think the German situation is really fascinating, as obviously, especially to this crowd, because it is absolutely clear that President Trump has done something unprecedented since 1945, which is that he has ceded leadership of whatever the West is. He has ceded leadership of the West. There's only one other person who can take that up, which of course is Angela Merkel. And I think she, of course, if we want to peer into her soul, is struggling because she too, having grown up, especially in Eastern Germany, is particularly burdened by German history. She knows what the right thing to do is. And I think, personally, I think that's why she responded the way she did to the refugee crisis. She said, Germans had a stain on history for not doing the right thing. Here's an opportunity to do the right thing. Let's do the right thing. I really don't think it was much more complex than that. And of course, as you all know, she basically almost lost her job for doing what she thought was the right thing. So the question will arise, is she willing to actually assume that leadership mantle? Because one of the things that is difficult about leading the West is nobody ever says thank you. And this is basically what's animating a lot of Donald Trump's rhetoric. He says, we've been paying for NATO for all these years. We've been paying for global security for all these years. And nobody has said thank you. Missing the point that what that means is you get a world that's stable, free, and that you get to lead for 50 years and get all the prosperity. And the world's a pretty nice place, especially if you're living in the United States. If you go other places, you can remember, see how nice the United States is. The question is, are the Germans going to be willing to cut that same deal, which will require them to do things that people will not only dislike, but here's the thing that's really going to be bad. They're going to say, we dislike it because you're German. You know, when the Germans send troops, which they haven't done yet really, when the Germans send troops into developing parts of the world to deal with terrorist threats, the response is not going to be, is that the right response? Which would happen if the Americans or the French or the British did it. The response will be, oh my God, the Germans are doing it. So if Merkel is willing to fight through that argument, fight through that pain, then I think that's the only way that she can assume this leadership role. And I actually think it's 50-50 on whether she's willing to do it. So. I think there's...
I have a question relating to Afghanistan and the Soviet Union. How much did the conflict in Afghanistan affect Gorbachev's decisions and what happened subsequently with the Soviet Union?
They were, in many ways, a canary in the mine shaft for him. First of all, he was part of the Politburo group, which was not told that the invasion was going to happen until after it had happened. So he was very upset that the military had usurped its powers, if you will. So he enters the entire Afghanistan thing with the perspective of we should never have been there in the first place. He assumes power in '85 and says one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to pull out of Afghanistan. Of course, as we know, that's not so easy. So by 1989, actually 1990, they finally pull out the last Soviet troops. And from his perspective, he wasn't so much worried about the cost of treasure that was going, Because in monetary terms, I mean, yes, the Soviets didn't have a lot to waste, but in monetary terms, it wasn't as big a war as others might conceive. What it really was a representation to him of the hollowness of Soviet society. That if you couple a declining society with a war that is clearly done for all the wrong reasons and that is sucking the life out of us emotionally, what we really need to do is, he thought, not so much stop up the economic bloodletting, but stop the moral bloodletting. Because our people are losing faith in our own institutions because everybody knows this is a bad war. So I think for him, that's really the perspective. It's not so much that he feels that it's going to draw them down too much, but that it's hurting their moral standing within their own people. And by the way, he also was a little bit of a pacifist, so he thought it was the wrong thing to do. So he wanted out. But what's really interesting is that he made that decision in early '86. And it still takes him several years. A man who's willing to overturn his own entire economic and ideological and political system. He has the guts to do that, but it still takes him 3 years to get up the political capital to actually extricate himself from Afghanistan. It's a real telling and ominous story.
If you could roll the clock back, would it have been a good idea or not to let the Baltics into NATO?
I ask myself that question a lot, which is a terrible thing to say because I shouldn't admit to you. That's the kind of question I ask myself a lot. Clearly, in retrospect, at this moment, it was a bad idea. In 20 years, I might tell you, clearly in retrospect, that was the best idea. I will also tell you that were I in power in the late 90s, and I saw the world moving in this democratic way, and I believed in the power of capitalism in particular, but also the power of capitalism plus civil liberty to promote a better society, and I think it's eventually going to happen in Russia. And I have people who are genuinely, in my ideology as an American policymaker and as a European policymaker, genuinely have been oppressed for 45 years, now asking for freedom. It's hard to say no.
Thank you. That's a very good historicizing answer.
It usually means that you didn't answer the question.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Had a great, I spent time as a soldier in Germany during the Cold War, 1968-69, and I was always struck by our wealth. We had 300,000 troops at that time in Europe and NATO, and at the same time we were fighting the Vietnam War with another about 500,000 troops. It just astonished me that we were able to sustain that, and naturally is no longer sustainable. The Soviet Union found that out, so spent themselves into bankruptcy trying to keep up with us, as you addressed. But my question is about the surprise ending of your presentation about Brexit. Are you attributing it to what's happening in Germany, in terms of immigration and the turmoil there? Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yes. So. First of all, let me admit I got the Brexit vote wrong. I actually lost $20 on that one. I thought they were going to stay in, and I think the reason is that at the very end, there was a big surge of nationalistic talk that was, people are going to come and take your jobs. Now, what I have to parse out here, and I think this is what you're alluding to, is within the British rhetoric, the pro-exit rhetoric, when they said people are going to come take your jobs, they weren't talking about Syrians. They weren't talking about the refugees that were in Germany. What they were really talking about were the Poles and perhaps people from the eastern parts of Germany who they worried would feel so much pressure from these new refugees that because they could move anywhere in the European Union, they would move to Britain and thereby undercut your job, was the major message. So when you combine outright lies about what was going to happen with the national health system, along with general, let's presume a third of the population is going to vote for something no matter what. I mean, I could say, I could put on the ballot, a third of the population would vote for the fact that the sky is actually orange. You know, it's just, that's numbers. But when you combine the last 2 or 3%, which I think were genuine fear that being part of Europe meant being connected to European lower wage workers who could come in from Eastern Europe in particular, who were feeling pressed by what the Germans have done in allowing even lower workers into their country, lower paid workers, that I think is the tipping point for the final vote.
I was intrigued by your comments about Angela Merkel and why she might have decided the way she did in the refugee time. I wonder what your thoughts are about the end of World War II and the few years after, in which so many Germans were refugees themselves, and how that might have played into that whole decision-making process. And she herself came from West Germany to live in the East as a child.
Yeah, you know, I feel very comfortable saying this at a institution with so many strong Catholic ties. I think that there comes a moment when policymakers realize they're going to have to answer to St. Peter for what they've done, whether they're Catholic or not. And I really think that that was a moment where she, because of the historical experience of having seen the traumas of war with her own eyes, because of the experience of having lived through a rebuilding where people were always talking about the traumas of war and the refugees, as you allude to, and also I think what's most important to my mind is because that she lived through, and I think it's important to recognize that she grew up, of course, in the East, not the West, where there's so much of the rhetoric of National Socialism was that this was a stain that you will never rub off if you are German. That this was a moment where I think she said, this is some soap, that we can do the right thing. And I think that clearly it was a political blunder in the way it was executed, but I also think that she's sleeping pretty well at night about what she's going to tell St. Peter. So, and I say that as a Jew, I know. So, what's that? Oh, I actually didn't know that. Oh, okay. Well, in that case, I'm doubly right. All right. So, always do what your father tells you to worry about. So. Yes, ma'am.
Could you say a few words about the rising threat of far-right organizations throughout much of Europe? I know it's very complex.
Well, no, I think that the most important thing to say is that the one silver lining of the last 18 months in American politics is recognition that this is not just a European problem. And I think that what is fascinating to me about the rise of the right in all of these areas is just how good it makes people feel without actually solving any of their problems. Because all the solutions that rightist groups are offering, put aside the social and put aside any notion of what it means to have a pure state or what it means to have a nationalistic state ethnically or religiously, their economic solutions are terrible. Both the German far right and the American far right basically would like to take their countries back to the 1830s, as near as I can tell in terms of trade policy. That's not going to work. So their solutions for all these people are not going to help, but gosh darn, it makes you feel good when your life is terrible and it's somebody else's fault. So I think until we resolve the fundamental issues of how to get this underclass in America, which never thought of itself as an underclass, and also this angered class in Europe, which is still angry and harboring historic anger over historic slights, until we get them integrated economically, the anger is not going to go away, because the anger is always there. It's just waiting for a place to surface. Basically, that's not a very optimistic answer, except to say that you can't solve this problem, but a good palliative is better economic times.
You alluded earlier in your talk about the decline of powers once money is put into military rather than infrastructure. It looks like that right now here. And I was wondering, based on what you've seen historically, do you think our current model of capitalism can actually get us out of this?
Well, when the revolution comes, I just need to be one step ahead of you. No, I don't think that we are making at all the right choices. But in order to not make the right choices, we would have to redefine our political values, and I don't see that happening. Let me give you a great example. You know about this kneeling before the national anthem phenomenon. Put aside whether you think it's a good idea or not. The meta problem of that is that we have created not so much nationalism in the United States as the civic religion that cannot be questioned, but military service as the civic religion that can't be questioned. Because what is it you hear? Anybody who kneels is disrespecting the troops. You've all heard this. Whether or not that's what they intend to do, that's how it's described by those who are upset. Because the troops and militarism are actually the things that we're all supposed to be united behind. That is exactly as Paul Kennedy would have described what happens to every empire when they begin to say, not only do we need to put our faith in our military power, but our military power is what defines us. And just to riff on this for a second, I am really bothered when I see presidents, Republican and Democrat. Barack Obama does it just as much as George W. Bush did it, and actually I don't listen as much as I should to Donald Trump because you can just read him on your phone. When they say, standing in front of a group of soldiers or airmen or seamen, these are the finest people that America produces. I don't know why we allow our politicians to say that. And I'm not dissing on the people who join the military, but rather to say, why don't they say it when they're standing in front of teachers or social workers or nurses or all kinds of people who do public service? And so the fact that we have narrowly defined militarism as the true epitome of what it means to be a good American suggests to me that we are not going to change our economic model and stop funding the military and invest in the things that are necessary. Now, lest I come off as a crazy whack job pacifist, I'm not. I think it's a matter of degree. You know, as you know, the United States currently spends more on its military than I think the last time I checked, the top 8 other militaries in the world combined. And we have 2,000 nuclear weapons with high accuracy. I'm feeling pretty safe, historically speaking. So I think we can ratchet one down without necessarily giving up the farm. And that's why I'll never get elected. So thank you all. Appreciate it.
Just what he said inside.
Oh, one more question. Oh, yes, sir. Yes, please.
What are the fears and the prospects in the long term for Europeans to shift their eyes from the West to the East, to Russia and Asia, in the decline of American power and the undermining of shared values?
Well, I think the fear is a traditional one, that they would lose their sense of who they are culturally. We were just discussing this at lunch. You know, the most powerful political ads of the last German campaign had nothing to do with economics or politics. They were all about, you don't want to change what it means to be a German. And the implication being, you don't want to become more Muslim, you don't want to become darker, you don't want to become more Asian. What it really means to be a German is traditionally defined. There is no way I think that the country and that Europe is going to go, and the French are having the same problem, are going to be willing to really turn their eyes to the East until they come to terms with what it means to the fact that their own demographics are actually changing. I mean, France is actually more fascinating in this regard to me than Germany, because the French are so explicit about it. You know, ask who is a Frenchman, you don't picture a black guy from Senegal. But demographically, that's actually just as likely as anybody else. And so until the French begin to change their conception of what it means to be French, they are not going to be accepting so much of the East, which is always going to keep them looking to the West. And by the way, I think countries in the East are not making it particularly appealing to look to the East. The Russians are not an appealing market at this point. Certainly, the Middle East is not typically a safe place. And the Chinese have done a really good job of making it clear that what they really care about are the Chinese. The difference between the British Empire and the American Empire and the Roman Empire was this curious notion that if we set up the rules of the game, we will prosper, but so will you. And then we'll all prosper. That is no way, shape, or form part of the Chinese national political economy. They are primarily concerned, and by the way, so is Donald Trump, primarily concerned with what's good for their own individual country, and that every deal must have a winner and a loser. I don't think that that's necessarily an appealing model for the Germans and for the French and for the other Europeans to glob onto for that reason alone. So I'm not particularly worried that they're going to look to the East, but I'm worried about the fact that they're not going to look to the East. I don't actually worry this much. I'm actually a very optimistic guy. Everything's going to be fine. So.
Well, we could be here all night. Thank you so much. Can you please help me?
Thank you all for your time. I appreciate it.
Great job. Thank you. So I predict that his book will be a bestseller, and if so it comes out next week. Jeffrey, next week?
2 weeks.
2 weeks. So you can actually, I have already pre-ordered my copy at Amazon. It's about $25 or something. So probably the price will go up dramatically.
Yes, cheaper if you buy it now.
Okay, cheaper if you buy it now. I will predict it's going to be a bestseller, not just because you love Jeffrey, but because it's going to be a good book. Thank you so much for coming. Have a safe trip home, and hope to see you next year in case we do this again. Thanks. Bye.